In the unforgiving expanse of Arizona territory, they say a man's true nature isn't measured by the shine of his badge, but by the steadiness of his hand when death comes calling. For young Deputy Daniel Cross, that truth was about to echo across the sun-baked streets of Silver Pine in ways that would forge a legend from the barrel of a gun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1876, and Silver Pine had seen its share of lawmen come and go, most of them carried out in pine boxes or running scared after their first real taste of frontier justice. The town itself sat like a defiant fist against the vast desert landscape, its weathered buildings and wind-worn signs testament to the stubborn determination of those who chose to call this harsh land home. But there was something different about the fresh-faced deputy who'd arrived on the dusty morning stage 2 months ago, though not in the way most folks expected. They called him schoolboy behind his back, and truth be told, he did look more suited to teaching arithmetic than enforcing the law. Deputy Cross spent most of his days perched on a rickety chair outside the marshal's office, nose buried in dime novels about famous gunfighters, his badge catching the merciless Arizona sun like a copper wink. His gun belt seemed to hang awkwardly on his slim frame, and the way he fumbled with his coffee cup each morning made old-timers at the Silver Spur Saloon shake their heads in dismay. The young deputy's Eastern-cut clothes and wire-rimmed spectacles only added to the general impression of unsuitability, making him look more like a misplaced schoolteacher than a frontier lawman. "Ain't gonna last a week," Hank Miller, the saloon's grizzled bartender, would mutter to anyone willing to listen. "Boy looks like he'd sooner shoot himself in the foot than face down a real desperado." The regulars would nod in sage agreement, their judgment sealed by the deputy's apparent fascination with those cheap paper tales of heroic lawmen and notorious outlaws. Hank had served drinks to real lawmen, hard men with eyes like gunmetal and hands scarred from countless encounters with the worst the territory had to offer. This boy, with his clean hands and proper speech, seemed like a cruel joke played on their town. What the good folks of Silver Pine didn't notice or chose to ignore was the way Deputy Cross's eyes moved above the pages of his dime novels, tracking every movement on the street with the precision of a hunting hawk. They missed how he positioned his chair at just the right angle to cover both the bank and the express office, or how his seemingly clumsy hands never strayed far from his Colt peacemaker. When the wind kicked up dust devils that danced across the street, those same hands remained steady as mountain stone, never losing their place in whatever tale he was pretending to read. Marshal Wade Garrett, a hard man who'd earned his reputation putting 13 notorious outlaws in the ground, had raised more than a few eyebrows when he pinned the deputy's star on what appeared to be a green boy, fresh from back east. Some said the marshal was getting soft in his advancing years. Others whispered that maybe he'd taken one too many blows to the head in his long career of enforcing frontier justice. Garrett's reputation had been built on his ability to read men, to see the steel beneath the surface or the weakness behind the bluster. His choice of Deputy Cross had shaken the town's faith in that ability. "Time'll tell," was all Garrett would say when pressed about his choice, though those who knew him well caught an odd glint in his eye when he watched his young deputy at his daily reading. The marshal had seen something in those first moments when Cross stepped down from the stage, something that made him offer the badge without hesitation, despite the young man's appearance. Sarah Mitchell, who ran the town's general store, was one of the few who'd managed more than a passing conversation with Deputy Cross. She'd been surprised to find him well-versed in poetry and literature, but there was something else about him that gave her pause. The way his gentle demeanor seemed to shift ever so slightly when trouble stirred in the street, like a cougar tensing before a leap. She'd seen it the day 2 drunk miners had started causing trouble near her store. Cross had appeared as if from nowhere, his voice soft, but carrying an edge that made both men step back, sudden sobriety in their eyes. The children of Silver Pine had made a game of trying to startle the young deputy while he read, sneaking up behind his chair with exaggerated stealth. Yet somehow, he always knew they were coming, greeting them by name without even looking up. From his dime novels, little Jimmy Walker swore he'd seen Deputy Cross practicing with his peacemaker behind the livery stable one dawn, hitting coins tossed in the air with impossible precision, but most folks dismissed it as a child's wild imagination. Jimmy's father, Tom Walker, had just laughed it off, saying his boy had been reading too many of those same dime novels the deputy seemed to favor. Even Buck Hawkins, the Silver Spur's imposing bouncer and a former bare-knuckle boxer, had developed a quiet respect for the young lawman after a brief encounter. No one knew exactly what had happened that night when Buck decided to test the deputy's mettle, but the next morning the bouncer was sporting a swollen jaw and treating Cross with the kind of deference usually reserved for rattlesnakes. When asked about it, Buck would just shake his head and mutter something about quick hands before finding somewhere else to be. The town's dynamic had shifted subtly in the 2 months since Deputy Cross's arrival. The usual troublemakers who frequented the Silver Spur seemed to drink a little less, watch their words a little more carefully. Perhaps it was the way the young deputy would glance up from his reading whenever voices were raised, his eyes carrying something that didn't quite match his bookish appearance. The Saturday night brawls that had once been as regular as church services had dwindled to almost nothing, though no one could quite explain why. Old man Jenkins, who'd fought in the war between the states and lost an arm at Shiloh, was one of the few who noticed things others missed. The way Cross's chair never creaked when he moved, how his seemingly casual shifts in position always gave him a clear line of sight to potential trouble spots, and most telling of all, the careful way he maintained his peacemaker when he thought no one was watching. Jenkins had seen the deputy's hands moving over the weapon in the pre-dawn light, each motion precise and practiced, like a surgeon preparing his instruments. "Reminds me of a sniper I knew during the war," Jenkins would mutter to himself. Quiet. Bellow looked about as dangerous as a church mouse, right up until he put a bullet through a Confederate colonel's eye at 400 yards. The old veteran had learned long ago that appearance and reality often stood as far apart as heaven and earth, especially when it came to men who dealt in death. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Silver Pine's main street, the heat rippling off the hard-packed dirt like waves off a desert lake. Deputy Cross turned another page in his dime novel, the story of Deadeye Dan and his legendary showdown at Devil's Fork. To anyone watching, he appeared completely absorbed in the tale, oblivious to his surroundings. But when 3 trail-worn riders passed through town, their horses' hooves kicking up dust devils that danced like restless spirits, his right hand shifted ever so slightly closer to his holster. The peace in Silver Pine had held for 2 months. Now, longer than anyone could remember in recent years. But those who'd lived in the Arizona Territory long enough knew that peace out here was like a diamondback coiled under a sun-warmed rock, beautiful to behold, but deadly when disturbed. And for those who knew where to look, there were signs that the peace was about to be shattered in ways that would change Silver Pine forever. The riders who'd passed through town wore the dust of hard travel, but their guns were clean and well-oiled. Their horses good stock despite the trail grime. They'd stopped briefly at the Silver Spur, asking casual questions about the town's law enforcement that weren't casual at all. Their eyes had lingered too long on the bank's front door, their questions about the marshal's schedule a little too specific. By sunset, word had spread through Silver Pine's gossip vine that they were scouts for the notorious Carson Gang, a brutal crew that had left a trail of robbed banks and dead lawmen across 3 territories, while the town buzzed with worried Whispers. Deputy Cross remained at his post, turning pages in his dime novel with the same unhurried movements. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how the young lawman's eyes lingered on the fresh hoofprints in the street, how he noted the direction the riders had taken when they left town, and how his free hand occasionally brushed the worn grip of his peacemaker with the familiarity of an old friend. But most were too busy hurrying home, securing doors and windows against the storm they could feel brewing on the horizon. Marshal Garrett stood in his office doorway, watching his young deputy through eyes that had seen too much death to be fooled by appearances. The telegram he held in his weathered hands seemed to burn with its warning. Carson gang headed your way. 15 dead in the last 2 months. No survivors left at Desert Wells or Copper Creek. The marshal's hand instinctively moved to his own gun, but his eyes never left the seemingly oblivious figure of Deputy Cross, still reading his dime novels in the fading light. Tomorrow would bring violence to Silver Pine, but for now, a young man who looked more suited to teaching school than enforcing law sat quietly, waiting for his moment to show the world that sometimes the deadliest shot isn't the one who wears his skill like a badge of honor, but the one who keeps it hidden until the perfect moment to strike. The next morning dawned blood-red over Silver Pine, the kind of sunrise old-timers claimed was an omen of violence to come. A hot wind whipped down the street, stirring eddies of dust that danced like restless spirits, while Deputy Cross took up his usual position outside the marshal's office, a fresh dime novel in hand. Today's tale was The Lightning Kid's Last Stand, though few noticed how the deputy's eyes seemed to study the gun-handling techniques described in its pages with particular interest. Sarah Mitchell opened her general store early that morning, unable to shake the feeling of foreboding that had settled over the town like a burial shroud. She watched through her front window as Cross settled into his chair, noting how his customary cup of coffee sat untouched beside him. Something was different about him today, the way he held himself perhaps, or the subtle tension in his shoulders that belied his relaxed posture. "Morning, deputy," Old Man Jenkins called out as he made his way past, his empty sleeve pinned neatly as always. "Mighty interesting sunrise we're having." Cross looked up from his book, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles with a scholarly air. "Indeed, Mr. Jenkins. Reminds me of something I read about weather signs and their historical significance in military engagements." The old veteran paused, leaning on his walking stick. Those who knew Jenkins well might have noticed how he positioned himself to keep both ends of the street in view. "That's so. Any particular engagement comes to mind?" "Gettysburg," Cross replied softly, his eyes meeting Jenkins for a moment. "Third day. They say the sunrise was just like this before Pickett's charge." Jenkins' weathered face didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He'd been there that day, had seen what happened when men faced withering fire from concealed positions. Without another word, he continued his morning walk, though those paying attention might have noticed how he took up a position on the hotel's porch, his walking stick close at hand. The morning wore on, heat building like pressure in a powder keg. Marshal Garrett had been conspicuously absent, having ridden out at first light with mention of checking the North Trail. Some wondered at his timing, leaving only his bookish deputy to watch over the town, but Sarah Mitchell remembered something. Cross had said the day before about how sometimes the best trap is the one that looks like an opportunity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Buck Hawkins arrived early for his bouncer duties at the Silver Spur, his jaw still carrying the faintest shadow of a bruise. He paused as he passed Deputy Cross, seeming to wrestle with something on his mind. "Them riders yesterday," he finally said, voice low. "One of 'em had a gun belt I recognized. Custom work from down Texas way. Used to belong to a lawman in Sweetwater, 'fore he was found face down in an alley 2 months back. Cross turned another page in his dime novel, the movement deliberate and unhurried. Interesting observation, Mr. Hawkins. I've always found that men who take trophies from their victims tend to be particularly dangerous and particularly predictable. Buck's eyes widened slightly, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. A group of riders appeared at the north end of town, moving with the casual confidence of men who owned whatever ground they stood on. At their head rode a giant of a man on a midnight black stallion, his duster covered in trail dust, but his guns gleaming with recent care. James Big Jim Carson cut an imposing figure as he led his gang down Silver Pine's main street. Railroad companies had put a $5,000 bounty on his head after the Copper Creek Massacre, where he'd left an entire town's worth of witnesses dead just to cover his tracks. Behind him rode his younger brother Luke the Snake Carson, whose skill with a throwing knife was said to be as deadly as any man's aim with a pistol. The rest of the gang spread out with practiced efficiency, 12 hard men who'd left a trail of death and empty bank vaults across 3 territories. Their reputation had grown with each successful robbery, not just for their brutality, but for their military precision. Rumors said Big Jim had learned his trade during the war, leading guerrilla raids that left both sides calling him a butcher. Deputy Cross didn't look up from his dime novel as the riders approached, though anyone watching closely might have noticed how his free hand had disappeared beneath his book. The gang pulled up in front of the marshal's office, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air. "Well, ain't this something special?" Big Jim's voice rumbled across the quiet street, carrying the gravel rough edge of too many nights spent around campfires. Whole damn towns rolled up tight as a drum, except for some bookworm playing at being a lawman. His men laughed, but those watching from behind shuttered windows noticed something odd. The way Cross held his book, not like a man lost in stories, but like a gunfighter might hold his cards in a high-stakes game, waiting for the right moment to show his hand. "You know what I find fascinating about dime novels?" Cross's voice carried clearly, still not looking up from his page. "How often they get the details wrong about real gunfights. Take Dead-Eye Dan's famous draw, for instance. The stories say he could hit a dime at 50 paces, but they never mention the most important part." "That's so." Luke Carson's hand drifted toward the knife at his belt, a cruel smile playing across his face. "And what's that, boy? In a real fight, it's not about how fast you can draw." Cross finally looked up, and something in his eyes made Luke's hand freeze on his knife handle. "It's about who's already aimed when the shooting starts." The street went deadly quiet. Big Jim's face darkened like a thunderhead, his massive hands moving toward his gun belts. "Only thing that's gonna start is us teaching a lesson about real law work to play-acting deputies who don't know their place." "Interesting. No choice of words," Cross mused, marking his place in the book with deliberate care. "About real law work. I've been reading another fascinating account lately about the Sweetwater Massacre, about a lawman who was killed for his gun belt, a custom piece from down Texas way." His eyes flicked meaningfully to one of the gang members who suddenly looked less sure of himself. Big Jim's scowl deepened. "Seems to me you've been doing too much reading and not enough learning about when to keep your mouth shut, boy." "Oh, I've learned plenty," Cross replied, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. "For instance, I learned that the Carson gang always sends scouts ahead, usually 3 riders, who ask specific questions about law enforcement and bank schedules. I learned that they typically strike at mid-morning when the bank's just opened. But the day's heat hasn't set in. And most importantly," he paused, adjusting his spectacles with his free hand, "I learned that they never check the rooftops." As if on cue, the soft click of rifles being cocked echoed from above. The gang members looked up to find themselves covered from every angle. Old Man Jenkins stood on the hotel's porch, his walking stick revealed as a shotgun cover. Buck Hawkins had positioned himself near the saloon's door, a Winchester appearing as if by magic in his massive hands. Even Sarah Mitchell stood in her store's doorway, a greener coach gun held with comfortable familiarity. "You see," Cross continued, as if giving a lecture on military history, "while you were focused on the obvious, the lone deputy reading his books, you missed the subtle movements. The way the townspeople had been preparing, positioning themselves, getting ready for exactly this moment. A classical example of misdirection, really, quite fascinating from a tactical perspective." Big Jim's face had gone from angry to calculating. 15 men against a town's worth of rifles might not seem like good odds, but he hadn't survived this long by backing down easy. "Awful lot of faith you're putting in everyday folk with guns, deputy. Willing to bet their aim against my boy's experience?" "An interesting proposition," Cross nodded, finally closing his book and setting it aside. "But you're making a common tactical error, assuming these are everyday folk with guns. Mr. Jenkins, there was a sharpshooter in the war. Mrs. Mitchell's late husband was a firearms instructor for the army. Even young Tommy up there on the roof of the grocery learned to shoot from his grandfather, who was a Texas Ranger." The gang members shifted uneasily in their saddles as they realized the extent of the trap they'd ridden into. But it was Luke Carson who finally voiced what some of them had begun to suspect. "Brother," he said quietly, eyes fixed on Cross's eerily calm demeanor, "something ain't right here. The way he's sitting, the way he talks about tactics, reminds me of stories I heard about a shooter back in Texas, fellow who'd act all peaceful and scholarly-like, right up until he put a bullet through your eye at 100 yards. Big Jim's expression shifted slightly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The professor," he muttered, using a name that carried weight in certain circles. "They said he'd disappeared after that business in Sweetwater, where he took down the Collins brothers without firing a shot." "Fascinating thing about reputations," Cross commented, still not having moved from his chair. "They tend to follow you, no matter how far you ride. Though I have to correct one detail. I did fire one shot in Sweetwater. The Collins brothers just never saw where it came from." The tension in the street had reached a breaking point. Big Jim's hand twitched toward his gun, but Cross's voice stopped him cold. "Before you try that," the deputy said calmly, "you should know that while we've been having this pleasant conversation, Marshal Garrett and a dozen territorial rangers have been moving into position behind you. They've been following your trail since Desert Wells, just waiting for the right moment. I do believe you'll hear them right about now." The sound of multiple horses and the mechanical click of rifles being readied carried clearly in the morning air. Big Jim Carson, for the first time in his violent career, found himself completely outmaneuvered by a man who looked more suited to teaching school than enforcing law. "You've been playing us since the scouts rode through," Luke Carson said, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. "All that reading, all them dime novels, just a show while you set your pieces on the board." "Not entirely a show," Cross replied, finally standing from his chair with fluid grace that seemed at odds with his previously clumsy demeanor. "These stories, while sensationalized, contain valuable lessons about human nature, about how men, like you think, how pride and reputation can blind you to the obvious." He adjusted his spectacles with his free hand, the gesture somehow more menacing than any threat could have been. "For instance, your reputation for never leaving witnesses actually made my job easier. It meant you'd never think to question the survivors of your previous robberies." "Because there weren't any." Big Jim's face showed dawning comprehension. "Sweetwater," he growled. "Copper Creek. Desert Wells. You've been herding us like cattle." "Fascinating analogy," Cross nodded approvingly. "Though I prefer to think of it as a scientific study. Each robbery provided data, your methods, your patterns, your weaknesses, the witnesses you thought you'd silenced. They spoke volumes through the evidence you left behind. A careful observer can learn more from how a man kills than from any words he might speak." One of the gang members, a scarred man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, suddenly jerked his horse around. "To hell with this! I ain't dying here!" But before he could spur his mount, a single shot rang out. The man's hat flew off his head. A neat hole punched through its crown. "That was from Tommy," Cross said conversationally, still not having drawn his own weapon. 12 years old and already a better shot than most men. Amazing what proper instruction can accomplish. His eyes met Big Jim's with cold precision. The next shot won't be a warning. The gang leader's massive hands had begun to tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of restraining himself from making a fatal move. "They said the professor never missed," he said quietly. "Said he could put a bullet through a playing. Guard at 50 paces. That true?" Cross smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Would you like a demonstration? Though I should warn you, these days I prefer more practical targets than playing cards." The street had gone deadly quiet. The only sound, the soft creak of leather, as the territorial rangers moved into their final positions. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the West's most notorious gang would handle being transformed from hunters into prey. "Maybe we could come to some arrangement," Big Jim offered, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man seeing his options dwindle to nothing. "Way I hear it, the professor used to work both sides of the law when the price was right." "Another fascinating aspect of dime novels," Cross replied, his scholarly tone unchanged despite the tension. "How they perpetuate myths and half-truths until they become accepted as fact. The professor never worked both sides of the law. He simply understood that sometimes justice requires a more subtle approach than a badge and a gun." His eyes hardened. "Like spending months playing the role of a bookish deputy just to bring down a gang that thinks itself too clever to be." Egot, the rising sun, had painted the street in shades of gold and shadow, turning the scene into something from one of Cross's dime novels. But unlike those sensationalized tales of Western justice, there would be no dramatic shootout, no test of speed and skill between legendary gunmen. The real art of the hunt, as the professor had demonstrated time and again, was in ensuring the outcome was decided long before the first shot was fired. Marshal Garrett's voice rang out from behind the gang, carrying the weight of official authority. "Drop your guns, all of you. The Carson gang's reign of terror ends here, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of manacles." At that moment, as the West's most feared outlaws realized the completeness of their defeat, Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, finally revealed why his reputation had once caused hardened killers to wake in cold sweats. It wasn't his skill with a gun, though that was legendary. It wasn't his tactical brilliance, though that had just been demonstrated. It was the patience, the meticulous planning, the willingness to spend months crafting a trap so perfect that his prey walked into it with their eyes wide open. As the gang members slowly raised their hands in surrender, Big Jim Carson locked eyes with the deputy one final time. "All this," he said, gesturing at Cross's books and scholarly appearance, "this whole act, just to catch us." Cross picked up his dime novel, carefully marking his place before speaking. "Consider it a lesson in the difference between appearance and reality. After all," his smile carried centuries of deadly wisdom, "the most dangerous shot isn't always the fastest draw, but the one you never see coming until it's too late." In the days following the Carson gang's capture, Silver Pine found itself at the center of a storm that would reshape the territory's understanding of justice. As newspaper reporters descended on the town, each eager to tell the story of how a scholarly deputy had outsmarted the West's most notorious outlaws, Deputy Cross maintained his quiet vigil outside the marshal's office, seemingly more interested in his dime novels than the commotion his victory had caused. But beneath the surface of the town's celebration, deeper currents were stirring. The territorial officials implicated by the Carson brothers' confessions had powerful friends, and whispers of retribution began to drift across the windswept streets like tumbleweeds before a storm. Marshal Garrett noticed how Cross's choice of reading material had shifted subtly, from tales of famous gunfights to histories of political conspiracies and corruption in high places. Fascinating thing about power structures, Cross observed. One morning, adjusting his spectacles as he discussed his latest reading with Sarah Mitchell, they're like spiderwebs. Disturb one strand, and the vibrations travel to every corner. The Carson gang wasn't just a band of outlaws. They were a symptom of a deeper corruption. Their capture has stirred up a nest that's been hidden for years. Sarah, who had taken to bringing the deputy his morning coffee personally, noticed how his seemingly casual posture allowed him to watch both ends of the street simultaneously. "That's why you're still here, isn't you?" she asked quietly. "The job's not finished." "In my experience, Mrs. Mitchell, the job is never truly finished. It merely evolves." Cross marked his place in his book with deliberate care. The Carson gang's arrest was like removing a single weed, necessary but insufficient if you want to prevent others from growing in its place. Old man Jenkins, who had started conducting informal shooting lessons for the town's younger generation, hobbled over to join their conversation. His shotgun cane now carried an air of authority rather than deception. "Been hearing things," he said, his voice low. "Riders coming through from the capital asking questions about the professor. Some of them don't look like any lawman I've ever seen." Cross nodded, his scholarly demeanor masking the tactical calculations clearly running behind his eyes. Another fascinating aspect of human nature, how those who profit from corruption often react more strongly to exposure than to the crimes themselves. They're not angry about what the Carson gang did. They're terrified about what they might reveal. As if to emphasize his point, a group of riders appeared at the edge of town. Unlike the Carson gang's bold approach, these men moved with a different kind of purpose, the careful positioning of professionals who understood the value of proper angles and fields of fire. Their clothes were too fine for common bandits, their guns too well maintained for simple thugs. "Mr. Jenkins," Cross said quietly, not looking up from his book, "perhaps now would be a good time to demonstrate to young Tommy the importance of proper rifle positioning from elevated areas." The old veteran nodded, understanding immediately. As he moved away with deceptive casualness, other townspeople began to shift positions with practiced ease. In the 2 months Cross had spent preparing them for the Carson gang, he had taught them more than just shooting. He had taught them to read situations, to understand the subtle signs of impending violence. The riders pulled up in front of the marshal's office, their leader a well-dressed man whose expensive suit couldn't quite hide the predatory way he carried himself. "Deputy Cross," he called out, his cultured voice carrying an edge of steel. "Or should I say, Professor Judge Morrison sends his regards." Cross turned another page in his dime novel, his movements unhurried. Judge Morrison. Yes, a fascinating case study in the intersection of legal authority and criminal enterprise. I've been reading quite extensively about judicial corruption in the territories. The patterns are quite illuminating. The well-dressed man's smile never reached his eyes. The judge is concerned about certain things, allegations being made by the Carson brothers. He feels they might have been unduly influenced in their statements. "Interesting choice of words," Cross replied, finally looking up from his book. "In my experience, truth rarely requires influence. It merely needs the proper conditions to emerge naturally, like a flower breaking through hard soil." "The judge is prepared to be generous," the man continued, his hand resting casually near his gun, "enough to ensure a comfortable retirement for a man of scholarly pursuits, far from any legal implications of unfortunate accidents." Cross adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. You know what I find most fascinating about attempted bribery? How it often reveals more about the one offering the bribe than the one receiving it. For instance, your presence here tells me that Judge Morrison is not merely concerned, he's desperate. The man's cultured facade cracked slightly. This isn't a negotiation, Professor. The judge's position on this matter is quite final. Another interesting word choice, final. It carries such weight, such certainty. Rather like the certainty the Carson gang felt when they rode into Silver Pine, convinced that a bookish deputy couldn't possibly be a threat. Cross's voice remained professorial, but something in his tone made several of the riders shift uneasily. In their saddles, the judge doesn't make threats, the man said coldly. He simply ensures that certain natural consequences follow certain choices. Ah, the language of implied violence, a fascinating subject I've studied extensively. Cross marked his place in his book with deliberate care. But you seem to be operating under a misconception. You see, I didn't choose Silver Pine at random, just as I didn't spend 2 months preparing this town solely for the Carson gang. The well-dressed man's expression flickered as he finally noticed what Cross had seen minutes ago, how the townspeople had moved with subtle purpose, taking positions that gave them clear lines of fire. How even now, rifle barrels were appearing at windows and on rooftops, held by hands that had been trained by one of the West's deadliest marksmen. Setting a trap for career criminals is one thing, the man said, trying to maintain his composure. Going after a territorial judge is quite another. Another fascinating observation about human nature, Cross replied, standing from his chair with fluid grace. How those in power often believe their position protects them from consequences. But justice, true justice, doesn't recognize artificial hierarchies. It merely recognizes actions and their natural consequences, rather like you mentioned. Marshal Garrett appeared in his office doorway, a telegram in his weathered hands. "Just got word from the Capitol," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the tense air. "Federal marshals arrested Judge Morrison an hour ago. Seems some interesting documents were found in the Carson gang's hideout, detailed records of payoffs, corrupt verdicts, and authorized murders stretching back 5 years. The well-dressed man's face went pale. "That's impossible. Those records were destroyed." "Were they?" Cross asked mildly, "or were you merely told they were destroyed?" Another fascinating aspect of corruption, how it breeds distrust even among conspirators. The Carson brothers weren't just keeping records as insurance, they were keeping multiple sets distributed among various hideouts, rather like how I've distributed evidence of Judge Morrison's crimes to multiple federal offices. The man's hand twitched toward his gun, but Cross's voice stopped him cold. "Before you make a tactical error, you might want to look at the roof of the general store. Young Tommy up there may be only 12, but he can put a bullet through a playing card at you. 50 paces, I know because I taught him myself." As if to emphasize the point, Tommy's rifle barrel gleamed in the sunlight, rock steady, and aimed with the precision Cross had drilled into him over countless morning practice sessions. "You've already lost," Cross continued, his scholarly tone unchanged. "Just like the Carson gang lost the moment they underestimated a deputy who read too many books. The federal investigation is already underway, the evidence secured, the witnesses protected. All that remains is to decide how many more. People will face charges for attempting to obstruct justice." The man's cultured facade crumbled completely as he realized the totality of his defeat. Like the Carson gang before him, he had walked into a trap that had been prepared long before he knew it existed. Judge Morrison hadn't sent him to deliver a bribe or a threat. He had sent him to test the winds, not realizing that the storm had already broken. "Fascinating thing about justice," Cross mused, as the would-be intimidators turned their horses to flee. "It's not always about the fastest gun or the highest authority. Sometimes it's about patience, about understanding that the biggest targets require the most careful preparation." As the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust, Sarah Mitchell approached with a fresh cup of coffee. "Will there be more?" she asked, her voice carrying both concern and determination. Cross accepted the coffee with a slight smile. "There are always more, Mrs. Mitchell. Corruption, like any weed, spreads its seeds widely. But thanks to what this town has learned, thanks to the strength you've all found within yourselves, Silver Pine will never again be seen as easy prey for those who think power puts them above the law." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, returned to his chair and his books. Buck Hawkins emerged from the Silver Spur, his massive frame moving with newfound purpose. "You knew this was coming," he said, not really a question. "Even before the Carson gang, you were preparing us for something bigger." Cross adjusted his spectacles, studying Buck with scholarly interest. "In my experience, Mr. Hawkins, criminal enterprises are like icebergs. What's visible above the surface is rarely the true threat. The Carson gang was dangerous, certainly, but they were merely the visible portion of a much larger problem. That's why you spent so much time teaching us about more than just shooting," Sarah Mitchell realized. "All those discussions about observation, about reading people and situations." "Precisely," Cross nodded approvingly. "A gun is just a tool, Mrs. Mitchell. The real weapon is the mind that wields it. By teaching this town to think, to observe, to understand the deeper currents of human nature, I've helped create something far more powerful than any single lawman could ever be." Old Man Jenkins hobbled back over, his eyes carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Reckon some folks ain't gonna take kindly to that. A town that can think for itself, that can't be bought or bullied. That's more dangerous to certain types than any gunslinger." "Another astute observation," Cross replied, turning a page in his book. "The truly fascinating aspect of corruption is how it relies on isolation and ignorance. When people stand together, when they understand the power of shared knowledge and collective action, the entire system begins to crumble." Marshal Garrett stepped off his office porch, his weathered face thoughtful. "Got another wire from the Capitol," he said quietly. "Judge Morrison wasn't working alone. Seems we've stirred up a whole nest of snakes in high places." "Good," Cross said simply, his scholarly demeanor carrying an edge of steel. "The larger the conspiracy, the more points of weakness it contains. Every corrupt official who falls will reveal connections to others, each revelation creating new opportunities for justice to take root." Tommy slid down from his rooftop position, clutching his rifle with pride. "You'll teach us more, won't you, Deputy, about how to protect the town from folks like that?" Cross's expression softened slightly as he looked at the boy. "The most valuable lesson I can teach you, Tommy, is that true strength lies not in the ability to fight, but in the wisdom to know what's worth fighting for. Silver Pine has become more than just a town. It's become a beacon, a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to bow to corruption." As night settled over the town, the implications of the day's events began to sink in. Silver Pine had stood against not just outlaws, but against the very system that allowed outlaws to flourish. They had challenged not just men with guns, but men with power, wealth, and the presumed authority of the law behind them. Thanks to the strength you found within yourselves, Silver Pine will face those challenges not as victims or bystanders, but as guardians of something precious. The idea that justice isn't just a word in a law book or a star on a man's chest, but a living force that grows stronger with every mind that embraces it, with every heart that chooses to stand against the darkness. Later that evening, as lamps began to flicker to life in Silver Pine's windows, Marshal Garrett and Cross sat on the office porch, discussing the day's events over coffee that Sarah Mitchell had insisted on bringing them. "Been thinking about something," Garrett said, his weathered voice carrying years of frontier wisdom. "When you first came here, you told me Silver Pine was perfect for trapping the Carson gang. But that wasn't the whole truth, was it? Cross looked up from his latest dime novel, a slight smile playing at his lips. Fascinating aspect of strategy, Marshal, how the best plans often serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Silverpine wasn't chosen just for its tactical advantages, but for its potential. Potential for what? Sarah asked, having lingered to hear the conversation. For transformation, Cross replied, his scholarly tone warm with genuine respect. This town had all the elements needed. Good people who'd been pushed too far, natural leaders like Mr. Jenkins who just needed direction, young minds like Tommy's eager to learn, and a strong sense of community that had been waiting for a catalyst to turn it into something more. Buck Hawkins joined them, bringing chairs from the saloon. The evening gathering had become something of a tradition since Cross's arrival, though now it carried new meaning. "Still don't understand one thing, Deputy," the bouncer said. "All these dime novels you read, there's more to it than just keeping up appearances, ain't there?" Cross held up his current book, Tales of Justice on the Frontier, with scholarly appreciation. "Every story, Mr. Hawkins, no matter how sensationalized, contains kernels of truth about human nature. These novels, with their tales of righteous lawmen and notorious outlaws, reveal how people think about justice and power. Understanding those perceptions is crucial when you're trying to change them." "Change them? How?" Tommy asked, having snuck back to listen despite his mother's calls to come home. "By showing that true justice isn't about fast guns or dramatic showdowns," Cross explained, his voice taking on the tone he used when teaching. "It's about community, about knowledge shared and burdens carried together. These stories focus on lone heroes, but reality shows us that lasting change comes from people standing united." Old man Jenkins nodded thoughtfully, his shotgun cane across his lap. "Like how you trained us not just to shoot, but to work together, to think about more than just our own piece of the fight." "Precisely," Cross agreed. "A single lawman, no matter how skilled, can be overwhelmed or corrupted. But a community that understands its own strength, that knows how to think and act as one, that's a force that can stand against any threat, whether it comes from outlaws or corrupt officials." As night settled fully over Silverpine, stars pricking through the darkening sky like distant lanterns, the group remained on the porch, their conversation turning to the future. They discussed plans for continuing the training Cross had started, for establishing regular meetings to share information and concerns, for building connections with other towns that might need similar guidance. "You won't be staying much longer, will you?" Sarah asked softly, voicing what many had begun to suspect. Cross closed his book carefully, marking his place with deliberate precision. "There are other towns that need what Silverpine has learned," he admitted. "Other communities struggling against corruption, wear a judge's robes or carry a banker's ledger. But that's the fascinating thing about knowledge. Once shared, it doesn't depend on the teacher's presence to remain powerful." "You've given us more than just shooting lessons," Marshal Garrett observed. "You've shown us how to see beneath the surface, how to recognize the signs of corruption before it takes root. And more importantly," Cross added, "I've shown you that the most effective response to darkness isn't always a bullet. Sometimes it's the light of understanding, shared among people who refuse to be deceived or divided." As the evening deepened, townspeople began drifting away to their homes, but there was a new strength in their movements, a quiet confidence that came from knowing they were part of something larger than themselves. Silverpine had been transformed from a vulnerable frontier town into a beacon of resistance against corruption, a transformation achieved not through violence, but through the patient application of knowledge and unity. The last lamp in the Marshal's office burned late into the night as Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, continued his reading, his keen mind already plotting the next phase of his ongoing war against corruption in the territories. But his greatest victory wasn't in the plans taking shape in his mind, or even in the capture of the Carson gang and the exposure of Judge Morrison's corruption. It was in the legacy he would leave behind, a town that had learned to think, to observe, to stand together against any threat, whether it carried a gun or a gavel. For in the end, the most powerful weapon against injustice wasn't speed or strength, wasn't a badge or a gun, but the light of knowledge shared among those, with the courage to use it wisely. And as Silver Pine had proven, when that light burned bright enough, even the deepest shadows of corruption had nowhere left to hide. The morning sun had barely touched Silver Pine's weathered buildings when a cloud of dust on the horizon announced new visitors. Deputy Cross, already at his usual post with a fresh dime novel in hand, noted how the approaching riders moved with military precision, not the loose formation of Judge Morrison's hired guns, but the disciplined bearing of men who'd learned their trade in uniform. Marshal Garrett emerged from his office, telegram in hand. "Territorial Rangers," he said quietly. "Word of what happened here has reached all the way to Washington. Seems the Carson gang's activities were just the tip of a very deep iceberg." Fascinating how patterns of corruption mirror natural formations, Cross mused, adjusting his spectacles as he observed the approaching riders. Like an iceberg, the visible portion often represents only a fraction of the true mass. The Carson gang's activities served as a visible marker for something far more extensive. The Rangers dismounted in front of the marshal's office, their leader a weathered man named Captain James Hawthorne, whose eyes carried the same calculating intelligence that Cross often displayed. "Deputy Cross," he said, foregoing formal introductions. "Or should I say, Professor, your reputation precedes you." "Reputations," Cross replied, marking his place in his book, "are fascinating constructs, Captain. They often reveal more about those who believe them than those they describe." Hawthorne's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "They say you were the best investigator the Secret Service ever had, before you disappeared after that. Business in Washington. 3 senators and a cabinet member were arrested for corruption, if I recall correctly." The townsfolk gathering to watch the exchange saw something shift in Cross's scholarly demeanor. Not a break in his calm facade, but a deepening of it, like still water revealing greater depths. "Another fascinating aspect of history," he said, his voice carrying subtle steel beneath its professorial tone. "How often the official records omit the most crucial details." "That's why we're here," Hawthorne said, producing an official-looking document. "The federal government is launching a full investigation into corruption in the territories. Judge Morrison's arrest was just the beginning. We need your expertise, Professor, your methods." Sarah Mitchell, who had arrived with her usual coffee delivery, noticed how Cross's hand moved slightly closer to his peacemaker, not a threatening gesture, but a telling one. "Methods," he repeated thoughtfully. "An interesting choice of words, Captain. My methods, as you call them, have always been rather unconventional for official channels." "Times are changing," Hawthorne replied. "The old ways of dealing with corruption, fast guns and frontier justice, they're not enough anymore. We need someone who understands that the real battles aren't fought with bullets, but with knowledge and patience." Old man Jenkins, who had taken up his usual position on the hotel porch, spoke up. "Ain't that what you've been teaching us, Deputy? About how the real fight ain't always the obvious one?" Cross nodded approvingly. "Indeed, Mr. Jenkins, though I find it fascinating how different people can draw very different conclusions from the same lessons." His eyes met Hawthorne's with quiet intensity. "For instance, some might see Silver Pine's transformation as a template for official action. Others might recognize it as proof that communities don't need official sanction to stand against corruption." The tension in the air thickened as the implications of his words sank in. Hawthorne studied Cross carefully, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're not just training towns to defend themselves," he said slowly. "You're building a network. Independent communities that can't be controlled or corrupted by any official authority, even a legitimate one. Another fascinating observation about human nature, Cross replied, his scholarly tone unchanged. How often we assume that authority and legitimacy are synonymous. The citizens of Silver Pine have learned to think for themselves, to question, to observe. That kind of independence can be uncomfortable for those used to wielding official power. Tommy Jenkins, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. Like you taught us, Deputy, about how the best defense ain't always a gun, but knowing who to trust and how to stand together. Precisely, Tommy, Cross smiled, though perhaps now you begin to understand why that lesson extends beyond just outlawing gangs and corrupt judges. Hawthorne's face showed a complex mixture of admiration and concern. Do you understand what you're creating here, Professor? A network of towns operating outside official control, trained in military tactics, sharing intelligence. I understand perfectly, Captain, Cross interrupted gently. I'm creating exactly what this territory needs. Communities that can think, question, and act independently. Places where justice doesn't depend on the integrity of a few officials, but on the collective wisdom and strength of its citizens. Buck Hawkins stepped forward from the gathering crowd, his massive frame carrying new purpose. Reckon that's why the senators in Washington wanted you gone, ain't it? Teaching folks they don't need to rely on corrupt officials for protection. Cross turned a page in his dime novel, the gesture somehow carrying more meaning than before. Another fascinating aspect of power structures, Mr. Hawkins, how they often fear educated, united communities more than any outlaw gang. An armed population can be controlled through force, but a thinking population. He let the implication hang in the air. Marshal Garrett, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Way I see it, Captain, you have two choices here. You can try to force the professor to work within your system, though I reckon that won't end well for anyone. Or you can understand that sometimes the best way to serve justice is to let it grow naturally, from the ground up. Hawthorne looked around at the gathered townsfolk, not just a crowd, but a community that had learned to think and act as one. He saw how they positioned themselves without obvious coordination, how their eyes tracked multiple angles of approach, how even the children showed awareness that went beyond their years. They said you were dangerous, Professor, Hawthorne said finally, but I don't think they truly understood why. It's not your shooting ability or your tactical mind that frightens them, it's this, your ability to teach others to think for themselves. Perhaps the most fascinating lesson of all, Cross replied, his scholarly manner carrying a hint of satisfaction. How the most revolutionary act isn't fighting the system, but showing others they have the power to change it. Silver Pine isn't just a town that stood up to the Carson gang, Captain. It's become something far more significant, a blueprint for how communities can govern and protect themselves without relying on potentially corrupt authority. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the street as the implications of Cross's words settled over the gathering. This wasn't just about law and order anymore, or even about fighting corruption. It was about fundamentally changing how justice worked in the territories, one town at a time. Washington won't like this, Hawthorne said, though his tone carried more resignation than threat. Another fascinating prediction. Cross nodded, adjusting his spectacles, though perhaps the more relevant question is whether Washington's approval matters more than the right of communities to protect themselves from corruption in all its forms. As the territorial rangers mounted up to leave, their mission technically unfulfilled, but their understanding profoundly changed, Sarah Mitchell approached Cross with a fresh cup of coffee. "You knew this would happen," she said softly. "From the first day you arrived, you were preparing us for more than just the Carson gang." As evening approached, the implications of the day's revelations continued to ripple through Silver Pine like waves in a pond. The territorial rangers had departed, But their visit had left the town with a deeper understanding of their role in Cross's larger vision. "Been thinking about something," Old Man Jenkins said, as he joined the usual evening gathering on the marshal's office porch. "All these lessons about strategy and observation, you weren't just teaching us to defend against outlaws. You were teaching us to think like you do." Cross closed his current dime novel, Frontier, Justice and the Law, with careful precision. "Another fascinating observation, Mr. Jenkins. Education in its truest form isn't about providing answers, but about teaching others to ask the right questions. Like how you taught us to watch for patterns," Buck Hawkins added, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Not just in how outlaws operate, but in how power itself works." "Precisely," Cross nodded, his scholarly demeanor carrying new weight. "The ability to recognize patterns, to understand the deeper currents beneath surface events, is crucial, whether you're dealing with armed bandits or corrupt officials. The principles remain the same, though the application may differ." Marshal Garrett leaned against the porch post, his weathered face thoughtful. "That's why you chose to work through small towns instead of official channels. Each community you train becomes another point of resistance against corruption." "Another fascinating aspect of strategy," Cross replied, adjusting his spectacles in the fading light. "How the most effective changes often come not from confronting a system directly, but from creating alternatives that make it obsolete. Every town that learns to think and act independently becomes a challenge to those who would abuse power." Sarah Mitchell, who had remained after bringing the evening coffee, spoke up. "But won't they try to stop you? Men like Judge Morrison, or even higher up?" Cross's smile carried centuries of wisdom. "The truly fascinating thing about power structures, Mrs. Mitchell, is how they often fail to recognize their own vulnerabilities until it's too late. By the time they understand the real threat, the changes are already too deeply rooted to stop." Tommy Jenkins, who had been unusually quiet, finally asked the question that had been bothering him. "But Deputy, if you're teaching other towns like you taught us, why do you still pretend to be just reading all the time? Why keep up the act?" "An excellent question, Tommy," Cross replied, his teacher's tone warming with approval. "Consider how a dime novel works. It appears to be simple entertainment, yet it can carry deeper messages for those who know how to read them. My appearance of scholarly harmlessness serves a similar purpose. It allows important work to be done while drawing minimal attention." The gathering fell silent as they contemplated this, understanding how Cross's methods reflected his deeper philosophy. Just as he had taught them to see beyond surface appearances, he continued to use appearances as a tool in his larger mission. "Reckon that's why the senators wanted you gone," Buck mused. "You weren't just exposing corruption, you were teaching others how to spot it, how to fight it without seeming to fight at all." Another insightful observation. Cross nodded. "Power maintained through corruption requires ignorance and isolation. When communities learn to think independently, to share information, to stand together, that power begins to crumble of its own accord." As night settled over Silver Pine, stars pricking through the darkening sky, the conversation turned to the future. The town had become more than just another stop in Cross's journey. It had become a model for what other communities could achieve. "You'll be moving on soon," Sarah said softly, not really a question. "There are other towns that need what Silver Pine has learned," Cross acknowledged. "Other communities struggling against corruption wear different masks, but operate on the same principles. But that's the fascinating thing about knowledge. Once properly shared, it continues to grow and spread of its own accord." Old Man Jenkins tapped his shotgun cane thoughtfully against the porch boards. "Like the seeds in Sarah's garden, plant 'em right, tend 'em careful, and pretty soon you've got something that keeps growing on its own." An apt metaphor, Cross smiled. Though perhaps with one crucial difference, the seeds we've planted here aren't just about growth, but about transformation. Silver Pine hasn't just learned to defend itself, it's learned to think in new ways, to question what others take for granted, to recognize that true justice often grows best in the spaces between official authority. Marshal Garrett studied his young deputy with new appreciation. That's what really frightens them, ain't it? Not just what you're doing, but what you're proving. That ordinary folks, properly educated and united, don't need to rely on corrupt systems for protection. The most revolutionary acts, Cross replied, his scholarly tone carrying steel beneath its gentleness, are often not the ones that confront power directly, but those that demonstrate its irrelevance. Every town that learns to think and act independently becomes living proof that there are alternatives to accepting corruption as inevitable. As the last light faded from the sky, Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, remained at his post, a new dime novel open in his hands. But now the gathering understood that every book he read, every lesson he taught, was part of a larger vision. He wasn't just fighting corruption. He was helping to birth a new kind of justice, one that grew not from the top down through official authority, but from the ground up through educated, united communities. Later that night, after most of the town had retired to their homes, Cross sat alone in the marshal's office, writing in a small leather-bound journal by lamplight. Marshal Garrett entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a telegram. "Just came in from Cedar Ridge," he said, placing 1 cup near Cross's writing hand. "Seems they had some visitors asking about a scholarly deputy who reads too many. Dime novels." Cross smiled slightly, not looking up from his journal. "Fascinating how quickly information travels, isn't it? Though I suspect the questions weren't coming from the usual sources." "Army intelligence," Garrett confirmed, settling into a chair. "Seems Washington's taking more interest in your activities than just sending territorial rangers." "As expected," Cross nodded, finally closing his journal. "The military mind tends to recognize patterns more quickly than civilian authorities. They'll have noticed how towns I've visited show similar changes: improved organization, better security, increased resistance to official pressure." "What are you working on?" Garrett gestured to the journal. "Plans for more towns?" In a manner of speaking, Cross adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. "I find it fascinating how the human mind processes information differently when it's written down. Each journal entry helps me refine the method, identify what works best in different situations. Silver Pine, for instance, has taught me several valuable lessons about the importance of existing community bonds." Garrett studied his deputy with newfound curiosity. "How many towns have you actually transformed?" "Another fascinating question," Cross replied, his scholarly tone carrying a hint of satisfaction. "Though perhaps not as relevant as how many. Towns have begun transforming themselves after learning the principles. Ideas, properly planted, tend to spread of their own accord." The marshal nodded slowly, understanding the implications. "Like a fire, catching in dry grass. An apt metaphor, though I prefer to think of it as more like education, spreading through a population. Each person who learns to think critically, to question authority, to recognize patterns of corruption, they naturally begin teaching others. The process becomes self-sustaining. That's what really scares them, ain't it?" Garrett mused. "Not just what you're doing, but the fact that it can't be stopped, can't arrest an idea once it takes root." Cross's smile carried centuries of wisdom. "The truly fascinating aspect of human nature is how often those in power forget this simple truth. They focus on controlling information, on maintaining authority, without realizing that the very act of suppression often accelerates the spread of ideas." As the night deepened, Cross returned to his writing while Garrett sat in companionable silence, both men understanding that they were part of something far larger than themselves. For in the end, The most dangerous threat to corruption wasn't a fast gun or a badge, wasn't an official investigation or a federal decree, but the simple act of teaching people to think for themselves, to stand together, to recognize that true justice wasn't something granted from above, but something built together, day by day, choice by choice, in towns like Silver Pine, across the vast expanse of the frontier. The lamp burned low as Cross made his final notes, each word another seed, planted in the fertile soil of change. And in homes throughout Silver Pine, people slept more soundly, knowing they were part of something larger than themselves, a quiet revolution being fought not with bullets and blood, but with books and wisdom, and the patient cultivation of minds free enough to question and hearts brave enough to stand together. Fascinating thing about revolutions, Cross mused as he finally closed his journal for the night. The most effective ones often go unnoticed until they're already won, not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual awakening of minds and the strengthening of communities that refuse to be controlled by corruption. Garrett nodded, understanding that he too was part of this larger transformation. Reckon that's why you chose this life instead of staying with the Secret Service. Teaching folks to think for themselves instead of just catching the corrupt ones yourself. Another insightful observation, Cross replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had found his true calling. For in the end, the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't the ability to outshoot or outthink your opponents, but the wisdom to teach others how to stand together against corruption in all its forms. As the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky, Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, prepared for another day of seeming to do nothing more than read dime novels while actually continuing his vital work of transformation. For he understood that true change came not from dramatic showdowns or official decrees, but from the patient nurturing of knowledge and unity in communities ready to think and act for themselves. The dawn that broke over Silver Pine brought more than just another day of frontier life. Riders had been arriving since first light, not soldiers or lawmen this time, but ordinary citizens from neighboring towns. They came in small groups, dusty from the trail but purposeful in their bearing, each carrying stories of their own struggles against corruption and their hopes for change. Deputy Cross sat in his usual spot, a fresh dime novel in hand, but his attention was keenly focused on the gathering crowd. Sarah Mitchell moved among them, offering coffee and breakfast to the travelers, while Old Man Jenkins and Buck Hawkins helped organize the impromptu meeting taking shape in front of the marshal's office. Fascinating thing about ideas, Cross mused to Marshal Garrett as they watched the scene unfold. How they tend to spread naturally once they find fertile ground. Each person who learns to question, to think independently, becomes a seed for further growth. Representatives from Cedar Ridge, Mountain View, and half a dozen other frontier towns had made the journey, drawn by word of how Silver Pine had stood against not just the Carson gang, but against the very system that allowed such corruption to flourish. They spoke in low voices of their own experiences, of corrupt officials, of justice denied, of communities living in fear of both outlaws and the very authorities meant to protect them. "We heard what happened here," said Jacob Monroe, a shopkeeper from Cedar Ridge. "How you didn't just fight back, you changed the whole game. Taught folks to think different about what justice really means." Cross marked his place in his book with deliberate care. "Another fascinating aspect of human nature," he replied, his scholarly tone carrying to the attentive crowd. "How often we mistake authority for justice, forgetting that true law comes not from badges or gavels, but from communities standing together with shared purpose." "That's why we're here," Monroe continued, newfound strength in his voice. "Cedar Ridge. Well, we had our own troubles. Judge Morrison might be gone, but there's others like him, men who think having power means being above the law." "Old Man." Jenkins stepped forward, his shotgun cane now a symbol of more than just personal defense. Reckon that's what the deputy's been teaching us all along. Ain't just about protecting ourselves, it's about changing how we think about protection itself. Cross nodded approvingly. An astute observation, Mr. Jenkins. Consider how traditional power structures rely on isolation, keeping communities separate, dependent on external authority for justice. But when those communities begin thinking independently, sharing information, standing together, they can't control us all, Buck Hawkins finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. That's why you work through small towns instead of big cities. Harder to corrupt a network of independent communities than one central authority. The gathering had grown larger as more riders arrived, the crowd now spilling onto Silver Pine's main street. Cross observed them with scholarly interest, noting how they naturally organized themselves into groups, sharing stories and strategies, building connections that would outlast any single confrontation. You know what I find truly fascinating about frontier justice? Cross addressed the crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. How often we focus on individual lawmen or outlaws, on dramatic showdowns and personal vendettas, but real justice, lasting justice, comes from communities that think and act together, that understand their own strength. Sarah Mitchell, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Like how you taught us to watch for patterns, to share information, to prepare not just for fights, but for change. Precisely, Mrs. Mitchell. Each community that learns these principles becomes not just stronger itself, but a source of strength for others. Knowledge, properly shared, creates connections that no corrupt official can break. A man from Mountain View, his face weathered by hard years, stepped forward. But they'll try to stop it, won't they? Men like Judge Morrison, they got friends in high places. Cross's smile carried centuries of wisdom. Another fascinating question, though perhaps not the most relevant one. Consider, how do you stop an idea once it takes root? How do you prevent communities from sharing knowledge, from standing together, from questioning authority that proves itself corrupt? You can't. Tommy Jenkins piped up from his perch on the hotel porch. That's what you've been teaching us, ain't it? How are ideas stronger than bullets? Very good, Tommy. Cross nodded, his teacher's pride evident. Though I would add that the strength of an idea lies not just in its truth, but in how it transforms those who embrace it. Each person who learns to think critically, to question authority, to stand with their community, they become part of something larger than themselves. Marshal Garrett, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Reckon that's what's really happening here. Ain't just about fighting corruption anymore. It's about building something new, something they can't stop because it's growing in too many places at once. The sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the gathering as Cross stood from his chair with fluid grace. Consider the implications, he said, his scholarly tone unchanged but carrying new weight. Each town that learns these principles becomes not just a point of resistance against corruption, but a center of teaching for others. The network grows naturally, organically, strengthened by the very attempts to suppress it. Like them plants in my garden, Sarah offered. The more you try to pull them up, the deeper their roots go, spreading underground where you can't see them. An excellent metaphor, Mrs. Mitchell. Cross smiled, though perhaps we might extend it further. Just as a garden requires not just planting but careful tending, so too does this movement require ongoing effort. Each community must learn not just to resist corruption, but to actively cultivate the conditions that prevent it from taking root. The representatives from neighboring towns listened intently as Cross outlined principles they could apply in their own communities. Not just tactics for physical defense, but strategies for building the kind of unity and awareness that made corruption difficult to establish and impossible to maintain. The fascinating thing about power, Cross continued, adjusting his spectacles, is how often those who hold it fail to recognize the true source of strength. They focus on controlling people through force or fear, forgetting that the most powerful force in human society is the simple act of people choosing to stand together. As the morning wore on, the gathering took on the character of a school session, with Cross guiding discussions about everything from organizing community watches to establishing networks for sharing information about corrupt officials' movements. But underlying every practical lesson was a deeper philosophy, one that emphasized the power of educated, united communities to resist not just physical threats, but the very systems that allowed corruption to flourish. Remember, Cross said as the session drew to a close, what you've learned here isn't just about protecting your own towns. It's about building connections, about creating a network of communities that think and act independently while supporting each other. That's what truly threatens corrupt power, not resistance from any single point, but the gradual awakening of an entire territory to its own strength. As the visitors began preparing for their journeys home, each carrying not just new knowledge, but a sense of being part of something larger, Marshal Garrett approached Cross with a fresh telegram in hand. "Word from the capital," he said quietly. "Seems Judge Morrison's friends in high places are starting to worry. They're talking about sending federal marshals to investigate disturbing patterns of organized resistance to authority." Cross's smile carried quiet satisfaction. "Fascinating choice of words, isn't it? They recognize the pattern but misunderstand its nature. They're looking for a conspiracy, for something they can fight directly. They don't understand that you can't stop an idea whose time has come, especially when that idea is as simple as communities learning to think and act for themselves." The sun had passed its zenith, casting long shadows eastward as the last of the visitors departed. Silver Pine had become more than just another frontier town that had stood against corruption. It had become a beacon, a source of hope and knowledge for other communities seeking to free themselves from the grip of corrupt power. Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, returned to his chair and his dime novels, maintaining his appearance of scholarly detachment. But now, watching the dust clouds of departing riders fade into the distance, he understood that his work in Silver Pine had achieved exactly what he'd hoped. The seeds of change had been planted not just in one town, but in the hearts and minds of people who would carry those seeds to fertile ground throughout the territory. As evening settled over, Silver Pine Cross held one final gathering on the marshal's office porch. Representatives from each visiting town had stayed behind specifically for this session, understanding that what they'd learned might be the most valuable lesson of all. "Been thinking about something you said earlier," Jacob Monroe from Cedar Ridge spoke up, "about how ideas are harder to stop than bullets. But what happens when they try to stop us by force, when they send men with guns instead of badges?" Cross closed his current dime novel, Tales of Justice on the Savage Frontier, with careful precision. "A fascinating question, Mr. Monroe, though perhaps not for the reasons you might think. Consider what happens when those sent to suppress an idea encounter not resistance, but understanding." "Understanding?" Buck Hawkins asked, his massive frame leaning forward with interest. "How do you mean, Deputy?" "Another fascinating aspect of human nature," Cross replied, adjusting his spectacles in the fading light. "How often those who serve corrupt power do so not out of malice, but out of ignorance or necessity. When they encounter communities that can think and act independently, that understand the very systems they're part of, well, that encounter often leads to unexpected results." Old Man Jenkins nodded slowly, comprehension dawning in his weathered face. "Like them territorial rangers. Today, they came expecting one thing, left understanding something else entirely." "Precisely," Cross smiled. "The most effective resistance to corruption isn't always direct opposition. Sometimes it's simply showing others that there's a better way, that communities can govern themselves, can maintain justice without relying on corrupt authority. Sarah Mitchell, who had been listening intently while serving coffee to the gathered group, spoke up. "That's why you teach the way you do, isn't it? Not just giving answers, but helping folks learn to think for themselves." An astute observation. Mrs. Mitchell, education in its truest form isn't about transferring information. It's about awakening minds to their own potential. Each person who learns to question, to observe, to think independently becomes not just a student, but a potential teacher. The evening deepened as Cross outlined more subtle aspects of his methodology. How to identify potential allies within the system, how to turn attempts at suppression into opportunities for expansion, how to build networks that appeared harmless on the surface while carrying deep currents of change. "Remember," he said, his scholarly tone carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "the most effective changes often appear insignificant at first. A reading group here, a community meeting there, people learning to share information and stand together. By the time those in power recognize the true threat, the roots are too deep to tear out." Tommy Jenkins, fighting sleep but determined to hear every word, asked what had been bothering him all day. "But Deputy, if this works like you say, if more towns start standing together, won't that make you a target? Won't they come after you harder?" Cross's smile carried centuries of understanding. "Another excellent question, Tommy, though it reveals a common misconception. The strength of this movement isn't in any single person, not even in the professor. It's in the ideas themselves, in the communities that embrace them, in the networks that grow naturally when people learn to think and act together." Marshall Garrett, who had been quietly observing, added his own insight. "That's why you keep up the scholarly deputy act, ain't it? Even now, when folks know who you really are, you're showing them it ain't about you, it's about what you've taught us." "Indeed, Marshall. Consider how power structures typically respond to threats. They look for leaders to eliminate, organizations to disrupt, chains of command to break. But how do you stop something that has no single leader, no central organization, just communities learning and sharing and standing together? As night settled fully over Silver Pine, stars pricking through the darkening sky like distant beacons, Cross shared one final lesson with the gathered representatives. "The truly fascinating thing about justice," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet evening air, "is how it naturally emerges when people are free to think for themselves, to question authority, to stand together against corruption in all its forms." The visiting townsfolk would depart in the morning, carrying with them not just new knowledge, but a deeper understanding of how true change happens. Not through dramatic confrontations or lone heroes, but through the patient cultivation of thinking minds and united communities. Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, remained on the porch long after the others had retired, writing in his journal by lamplight. The pages contained not just observations and strategies, but a vision of how justice could work in a world where communities thought and acted for themselves, where corruption found no fertile ground to take root. For in the end, the most powerful force for change wasn't a fast gun or a clever strategy, wasn't a badge or a title or even a legendary reputation. It was the simple act of teaching people to think for themselves, to stand together, to build the kind of justice that grew not from fear or force, but from the united strength of communities that had learned to question, to think, and to act as one. As the lamp burned low, Cross made one final entry in his journal, fascinating how the simplest truths prove the most powerful. That true justice isn't imposed from above, but grows from below. That real strength lies not in standing alone, but in standing together. And that the most effective revolution isn't one fought with guns and blood, but one that transforms minds and hearts until the old corruptions simply have nowhere left to take root. In the deepest part of night, when even the saloon had gone quiet and the last lamps had been extinguished, Marshal Garrett found Cross still at his desk, studying a map spread across its surface. Red marks dotted the territory, each representing a town that had begun to show signs of awakening to its own strength. "Got another wire from Washington," Garrett said quietly, placing a fresh cup of coffee beside the map. "They're starting to put the pieces together, not just about Judge Morrison and the Carson gang, but about the pattern of changes in these towns." Cross traced a line between several of the marked locations, his scholarly precision evident even in this simple gesture. Fascinating how different observers can look at the same pattern and draw such different conclusions. They're searching for a conspiracy, a structure they can understand, and therefore combat. But that ain't what this is it? Garrett settled into a chair, studying the map with new understanding. This is something else entirely. Indeed. Cross adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. Consider how traditional power structures operate. Hierarchical, centralized, dependent on control flowing from top to bottom. But what we're cultivating here is something fundamentally different. Each point on this map represents not just a location, but a community learning to think and act independently while supporting others doing the same. Like a web, Garrett mused, but with no center to target, no head to cut off. A fascinating metaphor, Marshall, though perhaps we might extend it further. In a web, each strand strengthens the whole. Each connection creates new possibilities for support and resistance. The more they try to tear it down, the more obvious its strength becomes. The Marshal leaned forward, pointing to a cluster of marks in the northern part of the territory. "These towns here, they've already started sharing information, haven't they? Warning each other about corrupt officials, supporting each other when trouble comes." "Another fascinating aspect of natural systems," Cross nodded, "how they tend to develop their own methods of communication and support, often in ways that those trying to control them never anticipate. Each community that awakens to its own strength naturally reaches out to others, creating connections that no amount of official pressure can sever." A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sarah Mitchell entered, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "Thought you might need something to keep your strength up," she said, revealing fresh bread and preserved meat. "Especially with all this planning." Cross smiled warmly. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've just provided an excellent example of exactly what we were discussing. Communities naturally support those working for their benefit, often in ways that seem small, but prove essential, like how the whole town pitched in today," she agreed, setting out the food. "Everyone doing their part, not because they were ordered to, but because they understood the importance of what was happening." Precisely. And that understanding, that voluntary participation, is what makes this movement so difficult to stop. You can't force people to unlearn wisdom they've chosen to embrace. Garrett studied the map again, noting how the marked towns formed natural clusters, each potentially supporting and strengthening the others. But they'll try to stop it, won't they, once they realize what's really happening? "Oh, undoubtedly," Cross replied, his scholarly tone carrying a hint of satisfaction. "But consider their options. They can't arrest an idea. They can't intimidate communities that have learned to stand together. They can't corrupt systems that operate on principles of shared knowledge and mutual support. Like Tommy said earlier," Sarah added, "they can't stop something that's already in people's minds and hearts." "An astute observation, Mrs. Mitchell. The truly fascinating aspect of this work isn't in the immediate victories, catching the Carson gang, exposing Judge Morrison, but in how each success demonstrates to more communities that they have the power to stand against corruption." As the night deepened toward dawn, the three continued their discussion, examining not just the spread of Cross's ideas, but their deeper implications for justice in the territory. Each marked point on the map represented not just a town, but a community awakening to its own potential, learning to think and act in ways that made traditional methods of control obsolete. "You've started something here that can't be stopped," Garrett finally said, as the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky. "Not just a movement, but a whole new way of thinking about justice." Cross carefully rolled up the map, his movements precise and deliberate. "Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of all, Marshall, is how this transformation was inevitable once people began to question, to think, to stand together. We've simply provided the catalyst for a change that was already waiting to happen." Sarah gathered the remnants of their midnight meal, her face thoughtful. "Is that why you choose to stay in the background, playing the scholarly deputy even now? To show that it's not about you, but about what you've helped people discover in themselves?" "Another excellent insight, Mrs. Mitchell. The strength of this movement lies not in any individual, but in the simple truth that communities thinking and acting together are more powerful than any corrupt system trying to control them." As the first rays of sun touched Silver Pine's weathered buildings, Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, prepared for another day of appearing to do nothing more than read his dime novels while actually continuing his vital work of transformation. But now, with the map safely stored away and the night's discussions fresh in their minds, those who shared his confidence understood that they were part of something far larger than themselves. A fundamental reimagining of how justice could work in a world where communities had learned to think, to question, and to stand together against corruption in all its forms. For in the end, the most powerful force for change wasn't bullets or badges, wasn't lone heroes or dramatic showdowns, but the simple act of teaching people to recognize their own strength when they stood together. And as Silver Pine awakened to another day, its inhabitants understood that they were not just participants in another frontier tale of law and order, but pioneers in a new way of thinking about justice itself, one that grew not from above, through force and fear, but from below through wisdom, unity, and the unstoppable power of communities that had learned to think and act as one. The days following Colonel Harrison's departure brought changes to Silver Pine that few could have predicted. Riders arrived daily, not with threats or shows of force, but carrying news and seeking wisdom. The town had become something of a legend throughout the territory, a place where a scholarly deputy had proven that true strength lay not in guns or badges, but in communities thinking and standing together. Deputy Cross maintained his usual post outside the marshal's office, his dime novels ever present, though those who knew him well noticed he was spending more time writing in his leather-bound journal. His scholarly demeanor remained unchanged, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his manner as he observed the fruits of his patient work. "Fascinating thing about change," he mused one morning as Sarah Mitchell brought his customary coffee. "How it often appears gradual until you step back and observe the larger pattern. Consider how Silver Pine has transformed in these past months." Indeed, the town had evolved in ways both subtle and profound. The daily gathering in front of the marshal's office had become something of an informal school, with visitors from neighboring communities joining the townsfolk to discuss everything from tactical defense to principles of community organization. "Never you thought I'd see the day," Old Man Jenkins remarked, watching a group of young men from Cedar Ridge practicing the observation techniques Cross had taught them. "Time was. Folk'd rather shoot first, then think about why trouble comes calling. Now they're learning to stop trouble before it starts." "Another astute observation, Mr. Jenkins." Cross nodded, adjusting his spectacles. "Though perhaps we might extend it further. They're not just learning to prevent trouble. They're understanding why it arises in the first place, how corruption takes root, and how communities can stand together against it." Marshal Garrett emerged from his office, a stack of telegrams in his weathered hands. "Word's spreading faster than we thought," he said quietly. "Not just about what happened with the colonel, but about what we've built here. Towns all across the territory are starting to ask questions, to think differently about what justice really means. Indeed, Cross replied, his scholarly tone carrying deeper meaning. Consider how ideas spread, not through force or official sanction, but through the natural recognition of their truth. Each community that awakens to its own strength becomes a beacon for others. The morning sun climbed higher as Silver Pine came fully to life. But it wasn't the same town that had existed before Cross's arrival. The citizens moved with new purpose, their daily activities carrying deeper significance. Even the children, led by young Tommy Jenkins, had their own roles to play in the community's ongoing transformation. "Been thinking about something you?" And Ted Buck Hawkins spoke up from his position near the saloon, about how the most effective changes often look like something else entirely. "That why you still keep up with them dime novels, even though everybody knows who you really are?" Cross smiled, marking his place in his current book with deliberate care. "A fascinating question, Mr. Hawkins. Consider how appearance shapes perception, how the image of a scholarly deputy reading adventure tales might seem less threatening than what we've actually built here." "A shield," Sarah Mitchell realized, her voice carrying new understanding, making folks think they're just seeing one thing, while something much bigger grows underneath. "Precisely, Mrs. Mitchell, though perhaps we might extend that observation to the larger pattern of what's happening across the territory. While authority focuses on visible threats, gangs, corrupt officials, obvious resistance, something far more profound is taking root." A rider appeared at the edge of town, moving fast, but not with the desperate haste that usually meant trouble. It was Jacob Monroe from Cedar Ridge, his face bright with excitement rather than fear. "Deputy," he called out, reining in before the marshal's office, "just got word from Mountain Valley. They did it, just like you showed us." Whole towns stood together, refusing to let that corrupt land agent steal their farms. Didn't fire a shot, didn't break a single law, just stood united and made him back down. Cross nodded approvingly, though his scholarly demeanor remained unchanged. "Fascinating how unity creates its own kind of authority, isn't it? When communities learn to think and act as one, they often find they have power they never realized." The key. News spread through Silver Pine like wildfire, each telling carrying new details. How Mountain Valley's citizens had used the techniques Cross had taught. Careful observation, coordinated action, unified purpose. How they demonstrated that true strength often lay not in confrontation, but in simply standing together against corruption. "You've started something here that can't be stopped," Marshal Garrett observed, watching the townsfolk gather to hear Monroe's tale. "Not just in Silver Pine, but across the whole territory." "Perhaps," Cross replied thoughtfully, "though I find it more fascinating to consider what started itself. These communities always had the potential for such strength. They simply needed to be reminded of it, to be shown how to think and act together." Sarah Mitchell, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "That's really what all them books were about, wasn't it? Not just keeping up appearances, but showing us how to learn, how to think for ourselves." "An excellent observation, Mrs. Mitchell. Consider how education truly works, not through imposing knowledge, but through awakening minds to their own capacity for understanding. Each person who learns to think critically, to question authority, to recognize patterns of corruption, naturally begins teaching others." The afternoon brought more riders, each carrying similar tales from different towns, stories of communities standing together, of corruption finding no purchase where people had learned to think and act as one. Silver Pine had become not just a symbol of resistance, but a source of practical wisdom about how justice could work when built from the ground up. "Fascinating aspect of natural systems," Cross mused, watching the growing gathering from his chair. "How they tend to develop their own methods of communication and support, often in ways that those trying to control them never anticipate." Each community that awakens to its own strength naturally reaches out to others, creating connections that no amount of official pressure can sever. Old Man Jenkins, who had seen more than his share of changes on the frontier, nodded thoughtfully. Like the plants in Sarah's garden, put down roots deep enough, spread wide enough, ain't no pulling them up without tearing up the whole ground. An apt metaphor, Cross smiled, though perhaps we might extend it further. Consider how ideas, once properly rooted, tend to grow and spread of their own accord. Each mind awakened to new possibilities becomes fertile ground for others. As evening approached, the gathering had taken on the character of a celebration, though not the rowdy kind that usually marked frontier victories. This was something quieter, more profound, the shared recognition that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that was changing not just their town, but the entire territory. "You'll be moving on soon, won't you?" Sarah asked softly, bringing a fresh cup of coffee as the sun began to set. Now that Silver Pines learned to stand on its own, Cross closed his dime novel with careful precision. "Another fascinating aspect of true education, Mrs. Mitchell, how it continues to grow and develop long after the teacher has moved on. Silver Pine has become more than just another town that stood against corruption. It's become a model, a proof that communities can govern themselves through wisdom rather than force." Marshal Garrett studied his deputy with newfound appreciation. "That's what you've really been building all along, ain't it? Not just a network of resistant towns, but a whole new way of thinking about justice itself." "Indeed," Cross nodded, his scholarly manner carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Though perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how natural it all becomes once people understand their own strength. Each community that learns to think and act independently becomes not just stronger itself, but a source of strength for others." As night settled over Silver Pine, the town hummed with quiet purpose, not the nervous energy of a place expecting trouble, but the steady determination of a community that had learned its own strength. Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, returned to his journal, recording not just the day's events, but the deeper patterns they revealed. Later that night, after most of the visitors had departed and the town had grown quiet, Cross held one final gathering on the marshal's office porch. The core group that had been with him from the beginning, Sarah Mitchell, Old Man Jenkins, Buck Hawkins, young Tommy Jenkins, allowed to stay up late for the occasion, and Marshal Garrett sat together in the lamplight, understanding that they were witnessing the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "Been looking at your map," Garrett said quietly, producing the worn document that showed Cross's network of transformed communities. "Starting to look like a web covering the whole territory." "Fascinating analogy," Cross nodded, adjusting his spectacles in the lamplight. "Though perhaps we might consider what such a pattern really represents, not just points of resistance, but centers of transformation, each supporting and strengthening the others." Sarah Mitchell, who had brought a late-night meal for the gathering, spoke up. "That's why you chose Silver Pine first, isn't it? Not just for trapping the Carson gang, but for starting something bigger." "Another excellent observation, Mrs. Mitchell. Consider how ideas spread most effectively, not through force or dramatic confrontation, but through demonstration and natural recognition." Silver Pine became not just an example, but a proof that communities could govern themselves through wisdom rather than force. Old Man Jenkins tapped his shotgun cane thoughtfully against the porch boards. "Like ripples in a pond, the way I see it, each town that learns to stand together sends out waves that touch others, showing them what's possible." An apt metaphor. Cross smiled, his scholarly manner warming with genuine appreciation, though perhaps we might extend it further. Ripples don't just spread outward. They interact, strengthen each other, create patterns more complex than their origins might suggest. Tommy Jenkins, fighting sleep but determined to stay alert, asked the question that had been bothering him. But deputy, if you leave, who's going to keep teaching folks? Who's going to help other towns learn what we learned? Cross's smile carried centuries of wisdom. Consider, Tommy, how true education works. It's not about depending on a single teacher, but about learning to think for oneself, to question, to understand. Each person who grasps these principles naturally begins teaching others. Like them reading groups you started, Buck Hawkins realized, wasn't just about the books themselves, was it? Was about getting folks together, teaching them to think and talk about ideas. Precisely, Mr. Hawkins, though perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how such groups tend to evolve naturally once established. They become not just places for learning, but centers for community organization, for sharing information, for building the kind of unity that makes corruption impossible to maintain. As the night deepened, stars wheeling overhead, like distant witnesses to their gathering, the conversation turned to the future. They discussed how Silver Pine would continue to serve as a model for other communities, how the networks they'd built would grow and strengthen, how the very nature of justice in the territory was being transformed from the ground up. Fascinating thing about change, Cross mused, making one final entry in his journal. How it often appears gradual until you reach a point where looking back reveals how profound the transformation has been. Consider Silver Pine now compared to when I first arrived, not just in terms of security or organization, but in how people think about justice itself. Sarah Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. Not just about protecting ourselves anymore. It's about building something that doesn't need protecting, something that grows stronger the more it's tested. Indeed, Mrs. Mitchell, though perhaps that's the most fascinating lesson of all, how true strength often emerges not from resistance to power, but from making certain kinds of power obsolete. When communities learn to think and act for themselves, to stand together against corruption, the very systems that once controlled them become unnecessary. As the last lamp burned low, casting long shadows across the gathered faces, Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, closed his journal for the final time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities to teach, new networks to build. But here in Silver Pine, he had helped create something that would continue to grow and strengthen long after he moved on. For in the end, his greatest legacy wasn't in the battles won or the corrupt officials exposed, wasn't in the networks built or the communities transformed. It was in the simple truth he had demonstrated, that true justice grows not from force imposed from above, but from the united strength of people who have learned to think for themselves, to question corruption, to stand together against injustice. In all its forms, previous content remains the same until the last paragraph, then continues with, in the deepest part of night, when even the saloon had fallen silent and the last lamps had been extinguished, Cross sat alone in the marshal's office, writing a series of letters by candlelight. Marshal Garrett, unable to sleep, found him there, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the quiet building. "These letters," Garrett said softly, settling into a chair. "They're for other towns, ain't they? Places you've already picked out, already studied." Cross looked up from his writing, adjusting his spectacles in the candlelight. "Fascinating how patterns reveal themselves, isn't it? Each community has its own potential, its own readiness for transformation. The art lies in recognizing when and where to plant the next seed. Like you did here," Garrett nodded, "choosing Silver Pine not just for what it was, but for what it could become." Indeed. Cross carefully sealed another letter. Though perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how such choices tend to reveal themselves naturally once you understand the deeper patterns. Each community has its moment when it's ready for change. The key is recognizing that moment and being there to guide it. Sarah Mitchell appeared in the doorway, carrying a fresh pot of coffee despite the late hour. "Couldn't sleep," she explained, pouring cups for both men. kept thinking about everything that's changed, everything that's still changing. Another fascinating aspect of transformation, Cross mused, accepting the coffee with a grateful nod. How it continues to evolve long after the initial catalyst. Consider how Silver Pine will keep growing, keep teaching, keep strengthening other communities, even after I've moved on. For in the end, his greatest legacy wasn't in the battles won or the corrupt officials exposed, wasn't in the networks built or the communities transformed. It was in the simple truth he had demonstrated, that true justice grows not from force, imposed from above, but from the united strength of people who have learned to think for themselves, to question corruption, to stand together against injustice in all its forms. The dawn broke over Silver Pine, painting the sky in shades of promise. The town would wake soon to find their scholarly deputy gone, moved on to plant more seeds of transformation across the territory. But they would also find his true gift remained, not in the man himself, but in what he had helped them discover, about their own strength, their own wisdom, their own capacity to stand together against corruption in all its forms. For in teaching them to think for themselves, to question, to unite against injustice, the professor had given them something far more valuable than protection. He had shown them how to make certain kinds of protection unnecessary. 6 months after Deputy Cross's departure, Silver Pine had transformed into something that few would have thought possible in the wild territories. The town hadn't just maintained the strength he'd helped them discover, they'd built upon it, creating a model of justice that was spreading across the frontier like wildfire. Sarah Mitchell's general store had become more than just a place of commerce. The reading room she'd established in the back, stocked with the very dime novels Cross had left behind, now served as a gathering place where people shared news, discussed ideas, and planned how to support other communities in their own transformations. Fascinating thing about knowledge, she often said, echoing Cross's scholarly manner, how it tends to grow stronger the more it's shared. The townspeople would smile at her unconscious mimicry of their former deputy, understanding that his influence lived on in ways both subtle and profound. Old Man Jenkins had turned his informal shooting lessons into something far more comprehensive. Young people from across the territory came to learn not just marksmanship, but the deeper principles Cross had taught. About observation, about thinking critically, about understanding the difference between power and justice. Ain't just about hitting targets, he'd tell his students, tapping his shotgun cane for emphasis. It's about understanding why you might need to, and more importantly, how to make it so you don't have to. Marshal Garrett's office had become a hub of information, with telegrams arriving daily from other towns that had begun their own transformations. The wall behind his desk displayed a map marked with red pins, each representing a community that had learned to stand together against corruption. The pattern spread like a web across the territory, growing stronger with each passing week. "Got a word from Copper Ridge," he announced one morning, emerging from his office with a fresh telegram. They just stood up to that mining company that's been trying to force folks off their land. Didn't fire a shot, didn't break a law, just stood together and made it clear they wouldn't be bullied. The news spread through town quickly, drawing people to the usual gathering spot in front of the marshal's office. Buck Hawkins, who had taken to organizing the town's information network, nodded with satisfaction. "That's 3 this month," he said, his massive frame leaning against the porch post. 3 towns that found their strength, just like the professor showed us, and each one becomes a teacher for others. Tommy Jenkins, who had grown inches both in height and wisdom since Cross's departure, spoke up from his perpetual perch on the general store's roof. "I've been thinking about something the deputy used to say, about how true change ain't about fighting power, but about making it obsolete." "An astute observation, Tommy," Sarah replied, unconsciously mimicking Cross's scholarly tone. "Consider How these towns are proving that justice doesn't need to be imposed from above when communities learn to maintain it themselves. The afternoon brought riders from Mountain Valley, not seeking help this time, but offering it. They'd heard about a small settlement further north that was struggling with corrupt officials, and they wanted to share what they'd learned about. Standing together. Fascinating how natural it becomes, Old Man Jenkins mused, watching the riders discuss strategy with Marshal Garrett. Way these ideas spread, the way folks learn to help each other. Almost like the professor knew this would happen, knew we'd keep teaching others even after he moved on. Word had continued to spread about the scholarly deputy who had transformed Silverpine, but the stories weren't about gunfights or dramatic showdowns. Instead, they told of how he had taught people to think for themselves, to question authority, to stand together against corruption in all its forms. Some said he had surfaced in other territories, still playing the role of a bookish lawman while planting seeds of transformation. Others claimed to have seen him in small towns across the frontier, always with his dime novels and scholarly manner, always teaching communities to discover their own strength. But the truth was, Cross's physical presence had become less important than the ideas he had planted. Each community that learned to think and act independently became a new source of teaching, creating a network that grew stronger with each passing day. As evening approached, Sarah Mitchell hosted one of her regular reading group meetings. The gathering had swelled to include visitors from 3 neighboring towns, all eager to learn from Silverpine's experience. The fascinating thing about the professor's method, she explained, holding up one of his dog-eared dime novels, wasn't just in what he taught, but in how he taught it. He showed us that true strength often wears disguises, that the most powerful changes often look like something else entirely. Buck Hawkins nodded from his position near the door. Like how he used them, books wasn't just about keeping up. Appearances was about showing us how to learn, how to think about different problems. Precisely, Sarah smiled, catching herself using another of Cross's favorite words. Consider how he taught us to read not just the stories, but the patterns beneath them. How he helped us understand that the most effective resistance to corruption often doesn't look like resistance at all. The discussion continued as night fell, with townsfolk sharing their experiences and insights with eager visitors. They talked about how Cross had taught them to organize, to share information, to support each other in ways that made traditional authority increasingly irrelevant. Marshal Garrett, who had joined the gathering, produced a recent telegram. "Got a word about Judge Morrison," he announced. "Seems he's been officially removed from the bench. Not just him, but 3 other judges who were part of his network. All done legal and proper, with evidence gathered by communities working together." A quiet satisfaction filled the room. This wasn't the wild justice of frontier legend, but something more profound. The natural consequence of communities learning to think and act together against corruption. "You know what I find most fascinating?" Tommy Jenkins spoke up, using one of Cross's favorite phrases. How nobody really needs to ask if the professor's still out there somewhere. What he started just keeps growing, keeps spreading, whether he's around or not. Old Man Jenkins tapped his shotgun cane thoughtfully. That's because he taught us something bigger than just protecting ourselves. He showed us that true justice ain't about force or authority. It's about people standing together, thinking for themselves, helping each other stay strong. As the meeting wound down, Sarah Mitchell retrieved something from behind her counter, Cross's original journal, left behind deliberately for the town to use. Its pages contained not just observations and strategies, but a vision of how justice could work when communities learned to govern themselves through wisdom rather than force. "The professor knew," she said softly, running her fingers over the worn leather cover, "that the real power of what he was building wouldn't depend on him. It would grow from people learning to think for themselves, to question corruption, to stand together against injustice in all its forms." For in the end, Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, had given Silver Pine and the territory something far more valuable than protection. He had shown them how to make certain kinds of protection unnecessary, how to build the kind of justice that grew not from force imposed from above, but from the united strength of communities that had learned to think and act for themselves. Previous. Content remains the same until the last paragraph, then continues with, later that night, after most of the visitors had departed, Marshal Garrett discovered something interesting while organizing his files. It was a letter written in Cross's precise hand, dated for exactly 6 months after his departure. He gathered the town's core group, Sarah Mitchell, Old Man Jenkins, Buck Hawkins, and young Tommy Jenkins, in his office. The letter's contents proved that the professor's planning had extended far beyond what any of them had realized. "My friends," Garrett read aloud in the lamplight, "if you're reading this, then Silver Pine has not just maintained its transformation, but has begun teaching others." Fascinating, isn't it? How natural such growth becomes once people understand their own strength. Sarah smiled at the familiar scholarly tone, even in written form. The letter continued, "Consider what you've built in these 6 months. Not just a strong community, but a model for others to follow. Each person you teach, each town you help transform, becomes another point of light in the darkness of corruption. The web grows stronger, not through force or official sanction, but through the natural recognition of shared wisdom." "Like he knew exactly what would happen," Tommy whispered, his young face thoughtful. "Knew we'd keep building on what he taught us." "Indeed," Old Man Jenkins nodded, unconsciously adopting Cross's manner. "Reckon that was his plan all along, not just to teach us, but to make us teachers." The letter went on to outline patterns they might expect to see, challenges that would arise, and ways to meet them. But more importantly, it contained a vision of how their work would continue to grow and spread. "The fascinating thing about transformation," the letter concluded, "is how it continues to evolve in ways even its initiators might not have foreseen. What you've built in Silver Pine isn't just a model for frontier justice. It's proof that communities can govern themselves through wisdom rather than force, through unity rather than fear." "That's why he left," Buck Hawkins realized, his voice carrying new understanding. "Wasn't just about moving on to teach other towns. Was about making sure we'd grow stronger without him." Marshal Garrett nodded, folding the letter carefully. Like he said so many times, true strength ain't about depending on any one person, even the professor himself. It's about people learning to think and stand together. The night deepened as they discussed the letter's implications, understanding that they were part of something even larger than they'd realized. Cross hadn't just transformed their town, he'd set in motion a change that would continue to grow and spread across the frontier. For in the end, what Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, had created wasn't just a network of resistant communities or a new approach to frontier justice. He had demonstrated something far more powerful, that true authority grows not from force imposed from above, but from the united strength of people who have learned to think for themselves, to question corruption, to stand together against injustice in all its forms. The dawn would bring new challenges, new opportunities to share what they'd learned. But Silver Pine slept soundly, knowing they were part of something larger than themselves. A quiet revolution spreading across the territory, carried not by force of arms, but by the power of ideas, taught first by a scholarly deputy who had proven that the deadliest weapon against corruption wasn't a gun or a badge, but the simple act of teaching people to think for themselves and stand together against injustice in all its forms. Previous content remains the same until the last paragraph, then continues with, "As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Marshal Garrett made one final discovery in the letter's envelope, a small, carefully drawn map of the territory marked with dates and locations. It wasn't just a record of where Cross had been, but a carefully planned sequence of transformations, each town chosen for its potential to strengthen the others. "Look at these dates," Sarah Mitchell said, studying the map in the growing light. "Some of them haven't even happened yet. He was planning months, even years ahead." "Fascinating pattern, ain't it?" Old Man Jenkins observed, unconsciously adopting Cross's scholarly tone. "Each town he marked becomes not just another point of resistance, but a center for teaching others. The whole territory's changing, one community at a time." Buck Hawkins traced the lines connecting different locations, like a web getting stronger. Just like he always said, each new town that learns to think for itself, to stand together, makes it harder for corruption to take hold anywhere. Tommy Jenkins, fighting sleep but determined to understand, pointed to their location on the map. "Silver Pine's marks are different from the others, got a star next to it, because this is where it really started," Marshall Garrett explained softly. Not just another town he transformed, but the first one to truly understand what he was building. The place where people learned not just to resist corruption, but to make it obsolete. The dawn light strengthened as they studied the map together, understanding that they were looking at more than just a record of Cross's work. It was a vision of how justice could spread across the frontier, not through force or official authority, but through communities learning to think and act for themselves. "The most fascinating thing," Sarah said, running her fingers over the carefully marked locations, "isn't just what he planned, but what's happening that he couldn't have planned. All these towns are learning from each other, supporting each other in ways even the professor might not have foreseen. That's because he taught us something bigger than just following his example." Old Man Jenkins nodded. "He showed us how to think for ourselves, how to recognize what needs doing and find our own ways to do it." The morning sun finally crested the horizon, sending long rays of light through the office windows. They fell across Cross's letter and map like golden arrows, pointing toward a future where justice grew not from the barrel of a gun or the power of a badge, but from the united strength of communities that had learned to stand together. For in the end, what Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, had created wasn't just a network of resistant towns or a new approach to frontier justice. He had demonstrated something far more powerful, that true authority grows not from force imposed from above, but from the united strength of people who have learned to think for themselves, to question corruption, to stand together against injustice in all its forms. Silver Pine would wake soon to another day of building on what Cross had taught them, of sharing their strength with other communities, of proving that the most effective weapon against corruption wasn't force or fear, but the simple act of teaching people to recognize and defend their own capacity for justice. And somewhere out on the frontier, in another small town needing transformation, a quiet deputy sat reading dime novels, waiting patiently for the right moment to plant new seeds of change. Seeds that would continue to grow and spread until corrupt power could find no fertile ground in which to take root, and justice would flow not from the force of authority, but from the united strength of communities that had learned to stand together, to think for themselves, and to make certain kinds of power completely obsolete. 1 year to the day after Deputy Daniel Cross first arrived in Silver Pine, a special gathering took place that would be remembered throughout the territory for generations to come. Representatives from over 20 transformed communities converged on the town, not to seek help or guidance, but to celebrate what they had built together and plan for the future. The main street bustled with activity as townsfolk and visitors shared stories of their transformations. Sarah Mitchell's general store had expanded to include a proper library, its shelves lined not just with Cross's old dime novels, but with books on history, law, and community organization. The reading room had been enlarged to accommodate the regular meetings that now drew people from across the frontier. "Fascinating how things change, isn't it?" she said to Old Man Jenkins as they watched the gathering from the store's porch. "A year ago we were just another frontier town, hoping to survive. Now look at us, teaching others how to build something that makes survival itself different." Jenkins nodded, his shotgun cane now more a symbol of wisdom than warfare. "Reckon the professor knew this would happen. Way he taught us wasn't just about standing against trouble, was about becoming something trouble couldn't touch." Marshal Garrett emerged from his office, where the wall map marking transformed communities had grown so detailed it needed constant updating. Red pins showed established centers of strength, while blue ones marked towns in the process of awakening to their own potential. The pattern spread across the territory like a constellation of hope. "Got word from up north," he announced to the gathering. 3 more towns just stood together against that mining company that's been trying to force folks off their land. Didn't need guns, didn't need badges, just needed to show they couldn't be divided or bought. Buck Hawkins, who had developed into one of the territory's most effective organizers, added his own news. "And that ain't all. Remember the corrupt officials working with the Carson gang? Last one just got sentenced. Whole network's been torn up, root and branch." Tommy Jenkins, now apprenticed to the marshal and showing promise beyond his years, spoke up from his customary perch. "Been thinking about something the professor used to say, about how the most effective changes often look like something else entirely. Reckon that's what we're really celebrating today." The afternoon brought more arrivals, including Jacob Monroe from Cedar Ridge and representatives from Mountain Valley. Each carried stories not just of standing against corruption, but of teaching others to do the same. The network Cross had envisioned had grown beyond even his careful planning, taking on a life of its own. "You know what I find most fascinating?" Sarah asked, unconsciously adopting Cross's scholarly manner as she addressed the gathering. "How natural it all becomes once people understand their own strength. Each community that learns to think for itself, to stand together, becomes not just stronger, but a source of strength for others." The meeting that followed in the town hall, and built specifically for such gatherings, wasn't about resistance or fighting corruption. It was about building something new, something that made certain kinds of corruption impossible to maintain. Old Man Jenkins stood to share his perspective, his voice carrying the weight of long experience. "Years ago, when the professor first came here, most folks thought justice was something that had to be imposed from outside. Now look at us, 20 communities and more, each standing strong because we learned to think for ourselves, to help each other, to make the old ways of corruption obsolete." As the sun began to set, Marshal Garrett shared something he'd been saving for this occasion, another letter from Cross, this one received just a week ago. The gathering fell silent as he read, "My friends, watching what you've built fills me with a fascination that goes beyond scholarly interest. Consider how far you've come, not just in standing against corruption, but in creating something that makes corruption itself increasingly difficult to maintain. Each community that learns to think for itself, to question authority, to stand with others, becomes not just a point of resistance, but a center of transformation. The network you've built isn't just about protecting yourselves. It's about creating a new kind of justice, one that grows from the ground up rather than being imposed from above." Perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how natural it all becomes. Once people understand their own strength, you've proven that true authority doesn't flow from force or official sanction, but from communities choosing to think and act together for the common good. The letter went on to describe new developments in other territories, where word of what they'd built had begun to spread. Communities far beyond their original network were starting to question, to think, to stand together against corruption, in all its forms. As night fell, Lanterns were lit around the town square, and the gathering took on the character of a celebration. But it wasn't the rowdy kind typical of frontier towns. Instead, it was the quiet satisfaction of people who understood they were part of something profound. Sarah Mitchell opened Cross's journal, kept safe this past year as a source of wisdom and inspiration. "Listen to what he wrote the night before he left," she said, her voice carrying in the evening air. "The truly fascinating thing about education isn't in what we teach, but in what people learn to teach themselves. Each mind awakened to its own potential becomes not just a student but a potential teacher. Each community that learns to think for itself becomes not just stronger but a source of strength for others." Perhaps that's the most powerful lesson of all, that true justice isn't something that can be imposed from above, but something that must grow from within. When communities learn to think for themselves, to question corruption, to stand together, they create something far more powerful than any system of control. The gathered representatives nodded in understanding, each seeing in their own communities the truth of those words. They had built something that went beyond resistance or reform. They had created a new way of thinking about justice itself. Buck Hawkins, standing near the marshal's office, pointed to the map with its constellation of pins. "Ain't just about the towns marked there," he said thoughtfully. "It's about what they represent, places where folks have learned to think differently about what justice really means." "Indeed," Old Man Jenkins nodded, unconsciously adopting Cross's scholarly tone. "Each point on that map isn't just a town that stood up to corruption. It's a place where people learned to make certain kinds of corruption impossible." As the gathering continued into the night, plans were made not just for maintaining what they'd built, but for helping it grow and spread. They discussed ways to support other communities in their awakening, to strengthen the networks of information and mutual aid, to ensure that what they'd created would continue to evolve and strengthen. For in the end, what Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, had helped them build wasn't just a system of community defense or a network of independent towns. It was a fundamental reimagining of how justice could work in the territories, not through force imposed from above, but through the united strength of communities that had learned to think for themselves, to question corruption, to stand together against injustice in all its forms. And somewhere out on the frontier, in another small town needing transformation, a quiet deputy sat reading dime novels, watching and waiting for the right moment to plant new seeds of change. But now he wasn't working alone. The changes he had started had taken on a life of their own, spreading and growing through the natural recognition of shared wisdom and united strength. As the gathering drew to a close, Marshal Garrett shared one final discovery. In Cross's old desk drawer, tucked beneath a stack of dime novels, he had found a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened 1 year after transformation begins." The core group that had started it all, Sarah Mitchell, Old Man Jenkins, Buck Hawkins, and young Tommy Jenkins, gathered in the marshal's office as he broke the seal. Inside was not just a letter, but a carefully preserved document that made them understand the full scope of what Cross had built. "My friends," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then what we started in Silver Pine has grown beyond any single community or cause. Fascinating, isn't it? How transformation, once begun, tends to take on a life of its own." The document, with the letter, proved to be a detailed analysis of how justice itself could evolve in the territories, written in Cross's precise scholarly hand. It outlined not just what they had already achieved, but what might be possible as more communities awakened to their own strength. "Look at these predictions," Sarah said softly, studying the pages. "Everything that's happened, every way the network has grown." He saw it all coming. Not just the obvious changes, but the subtle ones too. "Ain't just predictions, old man," Jenkins observed. It's a blueprint for something bigger than any of us imagined. Way he laid it out, what we've built here could spread beyond the territories, change how folks think about justice everywhere. Tommy, now wearing a deputy's badge, of his own, pointed to a particular passage. Listen to this. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of transformation is how it continues to evolve in ways even its initiators might not have foreseen. Each community that awakens to its own strength discovers new possibilities, new ways of standing together against corruption in all its forms. Buck Hawkins nodded thoughtfully. That's why he left when he did. Wasn't just about moving on to teach others. Was about making sure what he built here would grow on its own, become something bigger than just his teaching. The document went on to describe how the network they'd built could become self-sustaining, how each transformed community could contribute to a new understanding of how justice might work in a world where people had learned to think and stand together. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Marshal Garrett carefully folded the papers and looked at the gathered faces, the core group that had helped start it all. Now teachers and leaders in their own right. Reckon the professor knew exactly what he was building, he said quietly. Not just a way to fight corruption, but a whole new way of thinking about what justice really means. And every person in this room, every community in our network, is part of making that vision real. For in the end, what Deputy Daniel Cross, the professor, had created wasn't just a system of community defense or a network of independent towns. He had demonstrated something far more powerful, that true justice grows not from force imposed from above, but from the united strength of people who have learned to think for themselves, to question corruption, to stand together against injustice in all its forms. The dawn broke over Silver Pine, painting the sky in shades of promise. The town would wake soon to continue building on what Cross had started, strengthening the networks that made certain kinds of corruption impossible to maintain. For they had learned that the deadliest weapon against injustice wasn't a gun or a badge, but the simple act of teaching people to think for themselves and stand together. And somewhere out on the frontier, in another small town needing transformation, a quiet deputy sat reading dime novels, watching and waiting for the right moment to plant new seeds of change. But now his work was just one part of something larger, a fundamental reimagining of how justice could work in a world where communities had learned to think and act for themselves, to question corruption, to stand together until certain kinds of power became not just resistible, but completely obsolete. As the first rays of sun filled the marshal's office, Sarah Mitchell made one final discovery within the envelope. A personal note from Cross to each of them, written as if he had known exactly who would be there on this morning. To Marshal Garrett, whose wisdom saw beyond appearances and gave a scholarly deputy the chance to plant seeds of change. To Sarah Mitchell, whose understanding of how knowledge grows and spreads helped create something far beyond a simple reading room. To Old Man Jenkins, whose experience in war helped teach the deeper meaning of true peace through strength. To Buck Hawkins, whose transformation from force to thoughtful purpose showed others the path to real change. And to young Tommy Jenkins, whose quick mind and pure heart represent the future we're all working to build. Consider, my friends, how each of you has grown beyond what any teacher could impart. You've taken the principles I shared and developed them in ways I could never have predicted. That's the truly fascinating thing about education, how it continues to evolve through the wisdom of those who embrace it. The gathered group sat in thoughtful silence as Marshal Garrett read these words. Each could see their own growth reflected in Cross's observations, understanding how they had become not just students, but teachers in their own right. "There's more," Garrett said, turning to the final page. "Listen to this. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of what we've built together isn't in its current form, but in its potential for continued growth. Each community that awakens to its own strength discovers new possibilities, new ways of standing together against corruption. But more importantly, each transformed town becomes a living example of how justice can work when it grows from wisdom rather than force. The network you've created will continue to expand, not through any single person's efforts, but through the natural recognition of shared truth. Each mind that learns to question, each heart that chooses to stand with others, becomes another point of light in the darkness of corruption. Remember, what we've built isn't just about resistance or reform. It's about creating something that makes certain kinds of power obsolete. When communities learn to think and act together, when people understand their own strength, the old ways of corruption find no fertile ground in which to take root. Keep teaching, keep growing, keep transforming. For in the end, true justice isn't something that can be imposed from above. It's something that must grow from within, nurtured by wisdom and strengthened by unity. With deepest fascination and respect, the Professor. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long rays through the office windows that seemed to illuminate not just the gathered faces, but the future they were helping to build. A future where justice grew, not from force or fear, but from the united strength of communities that had learned to think and stand together. For in the end, what Deputy Daniel Cross, the Professor, had created wasn't just a system of community defense or a network of independent towns. He had demonstrated something far more powerful, that true justice grows not from force imposed from above, but from the united strength of people who have learned to think for themselves, to question corruption, to stand together against injustice in all its forms. The legacy he left behind lived on, not just in Silver Pine or the growing network of transformed communities, but in every person who learned to think critically about power, in every town that stood together against corruption, in every heart that chose wisdom over force. For he had proven that the deadliest weapon against injustice wasn't a gun or a badge, but the simple act of teaching people to think for themselves and stand together. And somewhere out on the frontier, in another small town needing transformation, a quiet deputy sat reading dime novels, watching and waiting for the right moment to plant new seeds of change. But his work was now just one part of something far larger, a fundamental reimagining of how justice could work in a world where communities had learned to think and act for themselves, where certain kinds of power had become not just resistible, but completely obsolete. For the Professor had proven that true revolution comes not from force of arms or dramatic confrontations, but from the patient cultivation of minds free enough to question and hearts brave enough to stand together. And as the sun rose on another day in the transformed territory, his legacy continued to grow and spread, changing not just how justice was maintained, but how communities understood their own power to stand against corruption in all its forms. Up. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.